Catherine Brown is Vice President of Collaborative Testing Services, Inc., an ISO 17043 accredited proficiency test provider in Sterling, Virginia. She's been employed by CTS for the last 18 years, since 2015. She's been responsible for overseeing both the 9 disciplines within the forensic department and several other interlaboratory testing programs. She holds a master's in forensic science and maintains membership in the Association of Forensic Quality Assurance Managers and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Laurel Farrell serves as the Senior Accreditation Program Manager for ANSI National Accreditation Board, or ANAB, Forensics Accreditation Program in Milwaukee. ANAB is a leader in the accreditation of forensic science laboratories to the recognized international standards. Ms. Farrell began her work in laboratory accreditation with ASCLD Lab in 2008 and continues to serve as a lead assessor for ANAB forensic assessment activities. And she is an accomplished forensic scientist in her own right. Brendan Max, who was one of the subjects in this test program, is the chief of the Forensic Science Division of the Cook County Public Defender's Office in Chicago. The Forensic Science Division is a group specially trained attorneys who litigate forensic science issues on behalf of indigent clients. Mr. Max has extensive experience in litigation cases involving forensic DNA and fingerprint evidence. Prior to his current position, he was an attorney in the Homicide Task Force in Cook County Public Defender's Office, where he was the lead attorney representing indigent clients charged with first-degree murder. Mr. Max is the author or co-author of an article on fingerprint proficiency tests, which will appear soon in the Journal of Forensic Identification, where he conducts training in the areas of crime scene processing, crime scene reconstruction, bloodstain pattern analysis, along with case analysis in the area of bloodstain pattern analysis and crime scene reconstruction. He's a graduate of the FBI's National Academy. He's a part-time instructor in the Graduate Forensic Biomedical Program at Boston University's School of Medicine. He is a past president of IAI, the International Association of Identification, and served as their representative on the Consortium of Forensic Science organization since 2008, and he is co-chair and treasurer of CFSO.
Good. Thank you, Matt. I'm real excited about this panel. I listened to a presentation by Brendan Max and 2 of his cohorts at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and thought this was he raised issues that should be discussed and addressed. So we have him come here today to talk about those issues with respect to his ability to pass a fingerprint proficiency test, although he had never been trained in fingerprint analysis. So we're going to start off with him talking about fingerprint proficiency test that he took and his observations about that. Then we'll go to Catherine Brown from CTS, who's going to talk about how they develop these tests and how they determine the difficulty and how they're processed and scored and so forth. The proficiency test that Brendan took was from CTS, so I'm very glad that she is here to discuss that. And then we'll hear from Laurel Farrell to talk about the role of proficiency tests in accreditation and why they believe that it's important under ISO to have proficiency tests in laboratories. And then we'll end up with this all-around good fellow next to me, Ken, who is a practitioner and will give the practitioner's viewpoint of proficiency tests. He's also, as I understand, developed proficiency tests as well in one of his many jobs. So I'd like to start off with Brendan, if you could. Yep. You there?
So good afternoon, everybody. I am really excited to be part of this panel. I am really super interested in proficiency testing, maybe way more so than I should be. But I became interested in proficiency testing a few years ago when in Chicago, in the Public Defender's Office, we started doing some kind of deep investigation of our local fingerprint lab. So in Chicago, there's really two crime labs that operate. One is the state crime lab, which is the bigger, more complete, well-funded crime lab system. And then within our local police department, there's the remains of what used to be a crime lab, which is now just a fingerprint division. And what we found when we were doing our kind of comparison of these two entities and looking at the examiners, fingerprint examiners in one versus the other, we found that while the examiners at the Illinois State Police received great training and seemed pretty competent to us and had good knowledge in the field, we could not say the same about the fingerprint examiners in our local lab. So are there any fingerprint examiners in here? So what we found out through our interviews is that they didn't understand basic fundamental concepts in their own field. So for instance, one concept that's critical for a fingerprint examiner to understand in order to distinguish an actual match from some other fingerprint is the concept of a close non-match. A fingerprint that looks like the source but is not actually the source. There's other important concepts like incidental similarity, the fact that two prints from different sources can just happen to look like each other randomly. And we found out that the fingerprint examiners in our local lab weren't even trained enough to understand some of the fundamental concepts in their own field. And yet what we found is that the fingerprint examiners in both labs, year in and year out, reported that they took proficiency tests and passed them year in and year out, the fingerprint examiners from the lab that seemed highly trained, as well as the fingerprint examiners from our local lab that seemed like they were, that their lab was substandard and that many of their examiners were kind of undertrained. So that's what got us really interested in fingerprint proficiency tests, interested enough that last year myself and two of my colleagues paid for and took the CTS fingerprint proficiency test, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But really proficiency tests have three really critical, important jobs in the criminal justice system, right? So results of proficiency testing have been used for quality assurance purposes, right? So examiners take them, labs can assess the results and decide when and where retraining is needed. That's a critical part of proficiency test use. So SWGFest, for instance, says that, yeah, use proficiency tests for this purpose. Use them to identify areas where improvements may be needed. So that's one really critical use of proficiency tests in the criminal justice system. Another one is discipline-wide validity. So you've got fingerprint examiners, including these fingerprint examiners with the FBI, published this article in 2009, which states that decades of proficiency test results, fingerprint examiners taking proficiency tests, doing really well on them, established that yes, this method is valid and we can render identifications, or in this case they use the term individualizations, because of the history of our examiners doing really super well on these proficiency tests. And then maybe most directly for my cases are fingerprint examiners testify in court. I mean, if you've ever heard any forensic testimony, whether it's fingerprint or otherwise, you've heard an examiner say as part of qualifications, I have taken and passed proficiency tests. They put it right there on their CV. Oftentimes, at least with fingerprint examiners, it's the only objective measure of their proficiency or competency, at least for examiners who aren't certified, right? So if you're not certified, maybe these proficiency tests are the only objective measure of your proficiency and competency. And then recently there's been some scholarship by Brandon Garrett and others who suggest that proficiency tests are really the only, if not the most critical data or information that a court should look at when trying to decide whether to qualify an examiner. Because these other benchmarks that have used before, such as experience and reputation, are not really good indicators of competency. So the fingerprint error rate studies show that there's no real correlation between, for instance, how many years you've been a fingerprint examiner and how good you do at these tests. So Brandon Garrett and others suggest that courts should turn almost exclusively to proficiency test results when looking at the competency and qualifications of an examiner and trying to decide whether to qualify an examiner as an expert. So these are real three critical areas in which proficiency tests play a big role in the criminal justice system. But tests that are too easy do not adequately serve any of these goals. So if you're using proficiency tests as your main quality assurance tool, and that test is calibrated to be so easy that everyone passes it, your quality assurance program will never identify breaking points or points where your examiners need to be retrained, because it's simply not calibrated difficult enough to identify those locations, those breaking points. So I'll just let you know from my perspective, including from having taken one of these tests, and I'm going to talk primarily about fingerprint proficiency tests today, but I have some reason to believe that kind of my belief on how easy these tests are applies to some of the other tests. In fact, I'm in the process right now of taking the DNA proficiency test, and I'll tell you I'm finding it easier than the fingerprint one. But let's look at historical data. So when we first were interested in looking at how hard these fingerprint proficiency tests were, it was 2018. We looked back to the last report from 2017, and we asked ourselves, what are the results like? What do they show about passage rates here? And in the 2017 CTS fingerprint test, there was 97% of participants who got all 12 right. 97% of participants who aced it. That would be like 97% of high school juniors getting a 1600 on the SAT. That's an ace, all of them getting that right. When you look just a little bit closer, 99% got either 100% on the test or missed one of the 12 examinations. When we looked back at the historical data for looking back a few years for the test, we found these kind of passage rates, people who didn't miss more than one question on these fingerprint proficiency tests, to all be pretty high. So that's, to me, one good indication that these tests might not be rigorous enough. So what we decided to do was to take the test. So who are we, or who am I? I'm an assistant public defender in Chicago. I have very little training in fingerprint examinations in comparison. I know some of the theory of it. I've been trained on the theory, but I had never previously done a true fingerprint examination, which means I'd never been given a set of 4 exemplars from 4 different people, or 3 or 2 or any, and had to do this searching function where you have a latent print and you're searching across 10 fingers and multiple palms to trying to decide whether you can locate the source of that. I had never done that. Since I didn't work in the lab, I had none of the software that fingerprint examiners use, so they can use software to quality map a print to decide which parts of print are high quality, where they should look for features, and which parts of print are low quality, so they should stay away. Those computer programs also help them map out their features. I had none of that, so I spent $9 on this jeweler's little magnifier, and I use that to help me look at the printed out fingerprint images and do my comparison. And here are my results. So out of the 12 questions, I got 11 correct. I did miss one, a false negative, meaning I said that for this latent print, it didn't match any of the 4 people were provided, when in fact it did. I think most kind of shocking to me is that the test wasn't complicated enough that I was forced into any kind of false positive. So never in the test was I given a comparison that was so close that I picked the wrong one. And it's really sometimes the false positives that we focus on in the criminal justice system. I think maybe sometimes a little bit too much, but certainly certainly I did not stumble into any false positives. So the question is, did I just get lucky, or was this test designed to be easy? And so going into the test, so it's not just the fact that I passed this test that I think should be maybe a little bit alarming to the field, but it's the fact that when you look at the data that was on this test and the questions and the comparisons I was asked to do, it's clear that this test was designed to be easy. So I knew that we would encounter some easy fingerprint comparisons. That's the green check, clear prints with abundant features. When you have a clear print with abundant features, the job is relatively easy to distinguish who the potential source of the print is. But what I wondered is, would we encounter distorted prints, one with few features? Those are ones that when examiners encounter them in casework can sometimes be problematic. I wondered if I'd encounter prints that were made in blood, because some data shows that examiners have a hard time with those as well, and that they can be tricky. I wondered if I would encounter tonal reversal prints, which when examiners encounter those in casework, they can be tricky as well. So an examiner, tonal reversal means an examiner's expectation about whether the ridges are the dark or the light is actually the opposite, and they can get tricked into thinking that what is the ridge pattern is actually the furrow, which will take the examination astray. I wondered if I'd encounter any of those. And then finally, I wondered if I'd encounter any close non-matches, so any situation where I have to make a tough call between two potential sources of a latent print that look very similar. And it turns out that I didn't really encounter any of those in this test. So first of all, in terms of distorted prints and prints with few features, the data in the industry shows that although there is no numerical threshold for features in fingerprint comparison, there is pretty much a de facto threshold. The research shows that around 8 or 9 features, examiners go from being uncomfortable calling an association to a print to being confident in that. So that's really about the threshold where if you're trying to give a challenging print, you're giving a print with maybe around 7, 8, or 9 features. And you can tell from the number of features that I marked for each of the prints where I made an identification that they were all well above that. There was no print that I encountered that was close to that threshold, no print that I encountered that was distorted enough and had so few features that it became a difficult comparison for me. We know that, as I mentioned before, that prints in blood, prints that exhibit tonal reversal are challenging ones. In fact, in 1995, CTS issued a pretty challenging fingerprint proficiency test. This is one of their images, and this is a print that was left in blood where I could identify about 5 features. Maybe a skilled examiner might find 1 or 2 more, but I doubt that much more. This is what a challenging fingerprint looks like. And by the way, in this test, the participants were also challenged by what is known as a close non-match. So the 2 prints that participants had to choose from up here as the potential source were from identical twins. So the fingerprints were actually very close to each other. And these 5 features that I charted out here, I could also find in both of these prints in a similar constellation, which would have made this comparison pretty challenging for examiners. And in fact was challenging for them because the passage rate, the error rate on that 1995 test was quite high. In fact, only 44% of participants on that 1995 test got all 7 right. So I didn't encounter any of those challenges in this test. And we know that test makers can design challenging fingerprint comparisons. In the FBI black box study, which is considered maybe the preeminent fingerprint error rate study, they had prints in there that were very challenging. They had this print in here that resulted in 1 false positive out of 30 comparisons, in part due to the distortion there. They also included this print that had 1 false positive in 26 comparisons. I think this one, if I recall right, was the one that had some tonal reversal, which made it, again, a more challenging print. So I did encounter these easy prints on the CTS test, these easy ones, but I did not encounter any of those types of challenging prints that are encountered in casework in everyday fingerprint comparisons in our jurisdiction. So it's not just that I got 11 out of 12 right. It's not that I got lucky. To me, it's that when you look through the fingerprint comparisons that we were asked to do on this test, it was an easy test, and it didn't include the types of difficult comparisons that are encountered in casework. It's not just me that's saying this. There's other research. This research paper came out last year at the same time when I was doing the CTS test. Henry Swafford, formerly of the U.S. Army Crime Lab, was doing a study of how rigorous or challenging CTS fingerprint images are compared to casework. They took 129 images from CTS, compared them to 215 prints from casework. They used the FBI's Universal Latent Workstation, which will give a quality score of how good or bad the prints are. And what they asked themselves are these prints that they encountered in the proficiency test equally as difficult, more difficult, or less difficult than the ones that you encounter in casework? And what they found was that the CTS tests were less difficult than the ones that you encounter in casework. So when you look at this chart, this quality metric score of 30 along the x-axis is a relatively low score, which means a relatively challenging comparison. On CTS tests over the years, you got maybe about 10% or so of prints that scored that low, whereas in casework you get much higher than that, at least in this casework sample of 215 cases. So what Henry Swafford and his co-author concluded was that CTS proficiency test images are easier than those encountered in casework. And there's been other indicators for years that these tests have been relatively easy. So one of the things that participants can do are leave comments when you finish your test. There's a comment section, and you can leave comments about what you think about the test. And over the years, examiners have been telling the test maker that the test is easy. So here, latent prints were not challenging enough. The pattern is visible in every latent. We would like to have more challenging latent tests. 2016, another comment along the same line. These tests could be more challenging, maybe partial with lower quality and clarity, especially the palms could be more challenging. They could identify them right away. And similar comments in 2015, that this test is, at least for some examiners, and the data shows probably for most examiners, not all of them, not very challenging. And then, of course, the president of CTS told the National Commission on Forensic Science just this, or about this in 2015. He said that easy tests are favored in the community, meaning forensic science labs apparently like easy ones. So that is how they are generated. So are these tests too easy? I think there's a lot of information out there in the field that yes, at least this fingerprint test is too easy, and probably others are as well. And to me, the accreditation process hasn't done anything to kind of manage that or improve that situation. So per accreditation standards, we know that labs are supposed to offer these, and examiners are supposed to take proficiency tests once a year. These tests, according to accreditation, are supposed to spot trends and identify retraining needs. ANAB is one of the major players in this space, right? They are the big, or one of the big, if not the biggest accreditation agencies for crime labs out there. And they identify approved providers, and so CTS is one of them, but I don't see anywhere where between CTS, accreditation agencies, other professional organizations, for instance, in fingerprints like SWIGFAST, are doing anything to monitor how rigorous these tests are. So we have these really critical uses of proficiency tests in the criminal justice system. And we know that proficiency tests may provide validity and may provide a QA system and may provide a measure of competency for examiners in clear prints, but it's not at all clear that it's doing the same for challenging prints that are encountered in casework. And this is especially, this failure to challenge test takers with close non-matches is especially critical and especially disappointing, because in our jurisdiction, majority of the fingerprints cases that we get are APHIS cases. And APHIS cases are ones where the distinction between the actual match and close non-matches is the most critical, because it's the job of APHIS to provide examiners with 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 prints that all look most similar to the latent print out of all the prints in the database. And because of that, this failure to test for close non-matches in proficiency testing is very troubling, because almost all of our cases are APHIS cases. So this 1995 test showed that examiners have problems with prints in blood, tonal reversal, close non-matches. Has retraining addressed this? Are examiners competent today in these areas that maybe they weren't before? Well, I would say that we don't know, because we stopped looking, and because no one has made examiners take tests that actually look for those types of challenges. We just don't know. The criminal justice system desperately needs qualified examiners and reliable forensic evidence. We have tons of evidence over time that hasn't always been the case, and we're hoping to improve that. I know everyone here, from defense attorneys to prosecutors to lab personnel, want reliable and valuable forensic evidence in court. One way to help make sure that happens is to improve the state of proficiency testing. We have to demand it. Courts have to demand it. Lab personnel have to ask for it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So first, thank you, Mr. Melson, for contacting CTS to be a part of this panel. We believe that engaging with all stakeholders is an important part in providing the best service that we can. To begin, ISO 17043 discusses the role of proficiency testing as follows: the evaluation of laboratory performance through interlaboratory comparisons using materials encountered in routine testing. And what is our role as a forensic proficiency test provider? To provide homogeneous case-like samples and to provide the means to evaluate laboratory performance. Homogeneity is extremely important in interlaboratory comparisons. The variability of a participant's results should lie exclusively in their processes and procedures and should not be inherent in the samples themselves. Let's start with the first role of the proficiency test provider, providing homogeneous case-like samples. To do this, CTS uses original items as much as possible. We are reluctant to move to the use of reproductions when original materials are successful, stable, and appropriate to the testing discipline. Reproductions, sometimes referred to as artifacts, are used in almost all impression evidence, as well as in handwriting, bloodstain, and gunshot residue. These reproductions are used first and foremost due to the inability to reproduce samples homogeneously, such as with latent prints, handwriting samples, shoes, or tires. Our tests are designed to eliminate specific variables. We put a focus on case-like evidence items and will look to standardize the known samples where possible. Our GSR test is a great example of this, as we provide reproductions of the known test fires, but provide an actual evidence item for their own evaluation. Another interesting example of the use of artifacts more than reproductions is our firearms test. We cannot provide the firearm, so instead we produce test shots from the known firearm that are examined in lieu of the actual firearm. The sample choices we make are not static. They are always being evaluated for each discipline we serve. Test sample performance and participant opinion are reviewed and documented within our quality system. We seek out expert guidance throughout our test development and production process. We solicit feedback from discipline-specific organizations and accreditation bodies. The advancement of the technology within a discipline also drives our testing program. I've been with CTS for 18 years, and the progression through the technological advances within the forensic biology and DNA discipline has been fascinating. The evolution of DNA kits is clearly documented within our proficiency tests through the types of loci collected and reported. Once we determine the appropriate samples for testing, we then need to look at the type of evaluation style. Quantitative schemes are easier to evaluate. However, they are rare in forensic sciences. Why are quantitative schemes easier? Because they are more standardized. ISO 13528 defines the statistical models that are used in interlaboratory testing. Worldwide, the large majorities of schemes utilize two confidence intervals, 95 and 99%. A 95% confidence interval means that 1 out of 20 results will be highlighted on average data, no matter how good, bad, or ugly the data was. This confidence interval is usually seen as a warning limit. If your results are indicated as being outside of the 95% interval, then a review should be performed. A 99% confidence interval will highlight 1 out of 100 results from that data set. Data indicated as being outside of the 99% confidence interval should trigger an action by the participant. These schemes are common in high-stakes industries like medical, automotive, or aerospace. In qualitative schemes, CTS determines consensus through a combination of expert evaluation, participant responses, and expected results. We have established a consensus baseline of 75% per test item. If that test item does not reach the 75% threshold, it may not be used in further performance evaluations. As you can see, I've provided the consensus rate per test item averaged over 5 years in some of our largest proficiency testing schemes, for both the full population and the accredited population. If the consensus rate in latent prints means the testing is too easy, then what about drugs analysis? Drugs analysis has not come under fire for the science behind their determinations. It is strongly instrument-driven, but it is still considered a qualitative test. Is there a drug in a sample, and what is it? So is the testing in this discipline too easy as well? Once the evaluation style is determined, then it can be utilized by the appropriate parties for the evaluation of performance. CTS is not a certifying body. Therefore, we do not grade proficiency tests. The final determination of performance is the responsibility of the laboratory and the accreditation body. We assist in that evaluation by providing the following tools. We highlight inconsistencies and provide consensus summaries in tabular format. Let's dive deeper into today's example. Mr. Max's team agreed with the consensus for 11 of 12 items within the 2018 first half latent prints examination test. They all reported the same latent print as non-identifiable when the known individual was provided within the known samples. The average consensus rate per item for this test was 98.4. The inconsistent results provided by Mr. Max's team were highlighted. The type of inconsistency, false negative versus false positive, is not a factor in how we mark inconsistencies from the consensus result. All three reported the same inconsistency. And for this item, the consensus rate was 95.5%. CTS was at the AAFS meeting in Baltimore this February, where Mr. Max presented his experience. We had a staff in attendance at his talk, and we had a booth on the exhibit floor. After his presentation, we were sought out by examiners who shared their impression of his discussion. And they were shocked that Mr. Max could say 11 of 12 was passing. They knew it would be viewed very differently in their lab, triggering reviews, possible retraining, and would have consequences during their testimony. Also, in a normal laboratory setting, the fact that all three test takers missed the same print would definitely put their laboratory's procedures into question. As a proficiency test provider, our experience is that inconsistent results are a major concern in laboratories, no matter the number of inconsistencies or the type, be it false negatives or false positives. They are investigated and can trigger multiple layers of reviews with possible retraining or procedural changes. So, are proficiency tests too easy? This question is continually asked, and it is the wrong question. Instead, we should be asking, do proficiency tests provide case-like samples? If proficiency tests accurately represent the typical situations faced by a laboratory, then we have achieved the core goal of a proficiency test. The consensus rate is not an indication of difficulty and should not be looked at as such. It is a tool to compare a participant's result to the general population for the determination of that participant's performance for that testing item. As I showed earlier, in most of our tests, we are seeing consensus rates with similar values to the 95 and 99% confidence intervals used by most industries outside of forensics. However, this is not by design. We let consensus rates fall as they may. The only time we take action is when it is close to our consensus base rate of 75%. Then we investigate if there was an issue with our samples. The fact that untrained individuals can take proficiency tests and return results that agree with the consensus does not diminish the validity of proficiency tests. If anything, it helps show that the underlying concepts found within that testing are understandable by a layperson, to include both the abilities of that discipline and the limitations. For example, in the latent prints test that Mr. Max and his colleagues took, the underlying concept is pattern matching. Pattern matching is a core concept in many forensics fields, be it by a human or a machine. Impressions tests, firearms, tool marks, GCMS results in drugs, or even the electropherograms evaluated in DNA, all are based on the matching of similar patterns. As long as we are providing case-like samples, a layperson being able to understand these concepts of forensic analysis is beneficial to all stakeholders. The Center for Statistics and Applications in Forensics Evidence, CSAFE, reached out to CTS to include a survey with our 2017 second half latent prints examination test. They requested participants to rate each latent print in the test for perceived difficulty and similarity to casework. For the perceived difficulty question, the scale went from a 0 to 10, with 0 equal to the latent being extremely easy, and a 10 rating for the latent being extremely challenging. For perceived difficulty, the latent prints in this test received an average rating of 4.27. For the similarity to casework question, the same 0 to 10 scale was used, with 0 indicating the latent was nothing like casework, and 10 for if the latent was exactly like casework. For similarity to casework, the latents in this test received an average rating of 6.97. For those of you, like me at times, who are not statistically inclined, a scale of 0 to 10 has 11 points, which makes a score of approximately 7 fall into the top quartile, or top 25%, of this scale as it relates to similarity to casework. The study also utilized the latent quality metric software available on the FBI's Universal Latent Workstation to rate the testing materials objectively. CTS known fingerprints scored 92.4, and our latent prints scored a 78.6. which both fall within the 90 to 65 range for qualitatively assessed good prints. So, within this study, were case-like samples provided? Yes. The findings of this study matched CTS's expectations. The knowns we provide were of high quality. As I've already explained, this is a deliberate action by CTS to remove this aspect of variability in testing. We recognize it can be less common in casework, but this is improving as fingerprint capture technology advances. Reducing the quality of the knowns would achieve a lower consensus, but that is not our focus. The latent prints provided were subjectively rated at a 7 and objectively at a 78. Another built-in aspect of proficiency testing is that we only provide latent prints which are of value for examination. We recognize that it is artificial and not like casework, but we need participants to provide a response for each item. Studies have shown that the value of identification determination is also highly subjective, which drives our need to provide higher quality items. And lastly, these were digital productions, not actual inked cards or lifted prints. For all of these key factors, we are not surprised by a lowered case-like perception and a higher LQ metrics rating. Overall, we feel that this study shows for that test, that moment in time, we provided valid case-like samples. In Mr. Max's presentation, he showed us a chart from another recent study by Gardner and Swafford that used the LQ metrics to look at a very large population of latent prints from CTS tests and compared them directly to a set of casework latent prints. At any point on that chart, the proficiency test items were rated no more than 10 points higher than the casework items. And the difference between the means, as reported by the authors, was 36.63 for casework versus 42.28 for CTS samples. And this is on a scale of 100. With the constraints on proficiency tests that I've discussed previously, we were pleased with the results of this study as well. So to restate, the scores that we have gotten both subjectively and objectively as our items relate to casework are quite remarkable, considering that the knowns are purposefully of high quality, the latents are already determined to be of value for identification, and the evidence items are digital reproductions, not lifts. Now, I knew I would not be able to ignore the concept of error rates and proficiency testing, but I only speak briefly about them, and these are my opinions. Our position is that proficiency tests are not the appropriate vehicle for the determination of error rates in any industry that we serve, not just forensics. However, since forensics deals more with qualitative, subjective testing, error rates determined through proficiency testing would be extremely specific to the individual and the sample. Aggregating these types of responses across individuals, samples, and the spectrum of difficulty in casework that we are discussing today makes it of dubious value. Lastly, the way that technology has been changing, error rates determined today will mean nothing in 10 years, maybe even less as we continue to automate forensics testing. Image analysis software is going to completely change this industry. We won't be looking at the error rate of individuals anymore, but the error rates of algorithms. So where do we go from here? I've explained where we are now and the tools we use to continually evaluate our services, but we are always evolving. The proficiency tests we produced in our first 20 years look nothing like our proficiency tests today, just as the ones we offer today will look nothing like our proficiency tests in the next 20 years. CTS will continue to focus on utilizing case-like, valuable, and relevant samples within our proficiency tests. We will continue to be open to the community and all stakeholders. We were the first and are almost the only proficiency test provider to publicly publish our reports, and we've been doing so since 2000. We do our best to assist with studies. CSAFE was just the most recent and relevant example, but when Mr. Max contacted us for permission to use our images in his paper, we not only agreed, but we took the time to provide him with high-quality digital images so he would not have to scan the photographs he received in the test. We attend important stakeholder meetings and conferences. I personally attended all but one of the National Commission on Forensic Science meetings. Our forensic staff has a presence not just as a vendor, but as attendees for educational purposes at almost all of the major forensics meetings and many of the smaller regional conferences. We respond to requests for interviews, be it with the PCAST or with journalists. It is why I am here today. And let me assure you, all of this engagement is not just for show. We have in the past and will continue to integrate appropriate changes into our proficiency test designs. Will we seek to design a proficiency test with a specific consensus rate? No. Would we look to swap an easy latent print for a more challenging one? Sure. However, this would not be in an effort to raise our perceived difficulty rating of 4.27, but to raise the perceived casework-like rating of 6.97. Our focus will always be on improving our ability to be more representative of casework, despite the acknowledged differences, than to set an arbitrary level of difficulty. Thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to engage with your community. I got you, Farrah. Look, I got you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and Ken, I'll add my thanks to you for including the accreditation aspect of proficiency testing, as it's one I think the room needs to understand, so I appreciate that. All right, let me see if I can figure out what I'm doing here. Oh, not that. Okay, so front and center today is the topic of proficiency testing. But I think it's important to start this presentation with acknowledging that, at least from the accreditation perspective, it's one tool in the toolbox. It's one piece in the puzzle, and only one. And that many aspects of accreditation and the requirements that provide the foundation for that support the overall quality system that's in place at a forensic service provider. So Ken asked me to address, what is the role of proficiency testing in a quality system? And from my perspective and accreditation perspective, what proficiency testing adds is that outside perspective, right? It is a mechanism to compare forensic service providers. The data that's provided does address the variability between forensic service providers that perform the same service. And importantly, as Kathy says, it does it on a large scale. It does it on a much larger scale than other types of inter-laboratory comparisons. For some of the forensic disciplines, they have the ability to get a bit of this outside perspective through the establishment of measurement traceability and the estimation of measurement uncertainty. But that's not the case for all forensic science disciplines. So for some, this is the only way that we truly can get that outside perspective of performance. So I can't talk about proficiency testing and accreditation without talking about the history, because there's a long history of proficiency testing and accreditation, and that started with the ASCLD lab. So that's the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board, a different entity than ASCLD that you've heard mentioned already today. So ASCLD Lab accredited the first laboratory in the United States, the forensic service provider in the United States in 1982. And those initial supplemental requirements included requirements related to proficiency testing. Initially, it was just at the laboratory level. Initially, it started as a desired requirement. In '93, the laboratory proficiency testing requirement moved to an essential requirement. And in 1997, the second requirement related to proficiency testing, the one that dealt with proficiency testing for each individual examiner, was added. ASCLD Lab did create a proficiency test approval program. They created that program back in 1995. It was the mechanism then to evaluate the work that was being performed by the proficiency test providers such as CTS. Accreditation of proficiency test providers only began in 2010, I want to say 14. Sorry, thanks, Kathy. Accreditation of forensic service providers moved to being based on an international standard. FQS was the first accrediting body in the United States to use ISO/IEC 17025 as the basis for accreditation in forensics. ASCLD Lab moved their accreditation program to being based on 17025 in 2004. But in the 2005 version of 17025, there is one mention of proficiency testing. It's found in section 5.9, titled Assuring the Quality of Testing Calibration Results. And you can read the clause for yourself there in clause 591. But at this point, it's referencing proficiency testing as something that a laboratory may include as one of a number of options for quality control procedures. 17025 upped the game in 2017 with the most recent revision. And for some of you that are not familiar with the standard, they totally renumbered everything. So now ensuring the validity of results is found in section 7.7. You can read there in clause 772 that there are requirements for the laboratory to monitor its performance by comparison with the results of other laboratories. And it requires the participation in proficiency testing and or participation in inter-laboratory comparisons other than proficiency testing. But when you read that requirement, there is no frequency that's required. There is also no requirement at the examiner level. It's probably a good time just to talk about definitions a little bit here. And these are right out of 17025. Proficiency testing is a subset of the larger inter-laboratory comparison. All right, proficiency testing indicates that the performance will be against pre-established criteria, whereas inter-laboratory comparison talks about doing the comparison based on predetermined conditions. Okay, so those are two different things. And then also it discusses intra-laboratory comparison. So intra-laboratory comparison is two or more people within the same management system who would be using the same test method, testing the same or similar item. Inter-laboratory now is going to put 2 or more laboratories with different management systems, different test methods, may even use different technologies to perform the same type of test to get the same test result. They all serve valuable purposes, but they're all slightly different. All right, one other aspect of the history of proficiency testing and accreditation to look at is the requirements of an accrediting body. And what this is going to tell you is that, again, accreditation has kind of been ahead of the game as it relates to proficiency testing. So there are requirements in ISO IEC 17011, which is the ISO standard that accrediting bodies are held to if we want to be recognized at either the regional or the international level. And those have been there for a couple of decades now, as well as in policies by ILAC that we must follow as a recognized accrediting body. Both of these requirements predate the requirement in 17025. So again, at an international level, there's a recognition of the value of proficiency testing. So how does all of this come together? Some of you may have seen this before, but we talk about this hierarchy of documents and how they interrelate with the analogy of a multi-layered cake. And if it's my cake, it has to be chocolate. So the bottom layer of the cake is the ISO standard, so 17025. ANAB forensic accreditation requirements form that next layer. So that's where we add the forensic specific requirements. The ANAB accreditation requirements need to be read in conjunction with 17025. The next layer on the cake may be other standards that apply to that forensic service provider. So they could be the FBI QAS standards, or it could be the American Board of Forensic Toxicology standards that you've heard mentioned this morning. The top layer of the cake is the laboratories management system, where they will be writing policies, procedures, instructions, methods to actually implement all of these accreditation requirements. And in that layer, we would expect them to consider state and local laws. So let's focus on the ANAB forensic sector specific requirements here and take a look at what we have in place today, but really they haven't changed much since the mid-90s. So in AR 3125, clause 7721, if you read that wording, you will see requirements at the location level or laboratory level, and at the discipline level. And you'll see requirements both for proficiency testing, participation prior to accreditation being granted, and then on an ongoing basis. Kind of the sister requirement to that is clause 774, and this is the requirement that focuses on the individual personnel of the forensic service provider. We have requirements for some type of monitoring on an annual basis in each discipline in which they perform work. The laboratory requirement is for proficiency testing. The personnel level requirement allows for proficiency testing, inter-laboratory comparison, intra-laboratory comparison, or if more appropriate, observation-based performance monitoring. Clause 775 lays some very basic ground rules for proficiency testing by the forensic service provider. Things like ensuring that the results are not known or readily available, ensuring the use of the approved methods of the forensic service provider, establishing criteria for determining successful completion prior to the monitoring activity. Kathy mentioned that the criteria is really to be set by the forensic service provider. It may be appropriate at times to use the consensus-based data and then relate that to the laboratory's normal expectations for performance. In a quantitative test, the criteria set by the forensic service provider may be set based on their estimation of measurement uncertainty. And I believe lastly here, clause 777 talks about the proficiency test provider themselves, and the current requirement is, if available and appropriate, that the proficiency test will come from an accredited provider. And if that is not available or not appropriate, because ANAB does work on in an international market, and proficiency tests are not as readily available in some of the countries where we are working today. We certainly need this pathway for people. Then there are other paths where they must provide ANAB what they are going to do, information on what they are going to do, and that needs to be approved. So one other aspect of the history of proficiency testing here before we go on, I wanted to just bring in ISO IEC 17020. I haven't heard that mentioned too much today, but we do have accreditation of forensic service providers in the United States based on both international standards. 17020 itself does not have any specific mention of proficiency testing. They do have a requirement for monitoring of personnel. The focus of this international standard is actually on-site observed monitoring, but layer on this all of the traditional ANAB accreditation requirements for proficiency testing at the discipline level by location, as well as the individual proficiency testing requirements in all of the disciplines in which the individual performs work. So another important aspect of this is our relationship with the proficiency test providers, CTS and others. ANAB receives data on performance directly from the proficiency test provider. We don't have the accredited forensic service provider send that to us. We get it directly from the PTP. That data is reviewed by some of our staff as well as members of proficiency review committees that we have established. That data is reviewed for trends. It's looked at and broken apart if different people are using different instrumentation, different technology. Can we see any advantages or disadvantages, strengths or weaknesses of different types of instrumentation or technology? Is there in fact a concern related or in relationship to this proficiency test that ANAB wants to communicate to a proficiency test provider? So our staff and the proficiency review committees serve that purpose for us. So pros and cons, right? Everything in life has pros and cons, and that's true about proficiency testing too. ANAB Forensics does not look at PT testing as the be-all, end-all by any means. We do acknowledge and are aware that some proficiency tests can more closely model the testing process than others. We do understand the limitations that a proficiency test provider has to provide a large-scale product and control for some of the variables that they need to control in order to limit, if there is less than acceptable performance, limit the cause of that. But I will still stand here and say that I believe all proficiency testing is useful. And right beneath that, I will say I believe that all proficiency testing will continue to evolve. Kathy talks about the evolution over her history in this industry. I certainly have seen it from all of the proficiency tests I took as a practitioner to my role now, and it will do nothing but continue to evolve and mature. So what has ANAB done, though, in kind of with our knowledge of the pros and cons of proficiency testing? Well, we do have other ANAB forensic-specific requirements that I believe help support, acknowledge, again, these pros and cons. We have specific requirements related to competency testing that are also supposed to be practical examinations that cover the spectrum of the work that that examiner will perform. Generally speaking, competency testings are going to be broader than proficiency testing. Okay? But even competency testing, again, is not everything. I started here and I'm going to end here. Proficiency testing is one piece of the puzzle that is put together with all of the other accreditation requirements that become part of accreditation based on ISO IEC 17025 or 17020. And I think it's crucial that we remember that there are all of these pieces to the puzzle that provide that framework to ensure the quality of the test or calibration result reported.
Thank you very much.
All right, so what I was to talk about is a proficiency test taker. Again, my background, I was with Massachusetts State Police for 33 years. In the last 13 years, I commanded the crime scene services section. Basically, I would oversee all the impression evidence. So what we had was the latent print section, footwear, tire track, bloodstain pattern analysis, as well as crime scene. We are accredited under 17025, even the crime scene unit. So therefore, we would take proficiency tests, and I, as the director of the section, would also take cases too. That's the way we were set up. So therefore, I was taking proficiency tests in the area of latent print, footwear, bloodstain pattern analysis, and also crime scene. I've also created a couple of internal tests in the area of latent print identification as well as crime scene. So having said that, one of the things, or one of the slides that would or should have been there, one of the first ones is what type of testing. I think there's a misrepresentation or misconception, I should say, as far as what exactly a proficiency test is. If you're going to, first of all, are you going to give a proficiency test? CTS comes in a package, and I can hand that off to someone, maybe as Max received it, and I can sit down and I can take all of those latent impressions and I can try to match them up to my notes. On the other hand, you can take that as casework, because one of the other things that you want to take a look at is your system, your quality system. So we insert that as an actual case. So now we're actually not only looking at the examiner, but we're looking at the examiner as he works through the system to ensure that he is complying with all our standards. And then lastly, one of the other things that we take a look at least up in Massachusetts, we had to submit our prints into APHIS, and we had to have some type of test to ensure that when I submit, or the examiner submits his latent into the APHIS system, that they're able not only to be able to enter the print, but they're also able to retrieve the results of the print and look at the results, and again, if we have some close non-matches, to be able to exclude those close non-matches. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, whether you're going to take it as casework, and that's the other thing. If it's a test, are you sitting down as you conceptualize a normal test or a regular test? I'm going to take that until completion. If you're in fact taking that as as casework, one of the things that you'd have to take a look at, and it was out in the Human Factors publication several years ago, which I served on. Normally, you're going to do your comparisons in the morning because your eyes do get tired. So it's not inconceivable that over a couple days I would be looking at those images or that package or that particular test. So again, how am I going to administer and how am I going to take that test? Likewise, are you going to take it blind or an open? Let's start with open test. You know it's a proficiency test. So essentially, you can take it as a case. The images are put in there, the latents are put in there as the latents from a potential scenario when you have all of your paperwork. Or you can have it as a blind test. In other words, your quality assurance person or your quality assurance section would take those images and insert them as a case. Likewise, what type of images are you getting? It's kind of interesting. I have a study here I'll talk about a little bit over in Europe. One of the things that they look at, or they try to test is when evidence comes in, obviously you have the ability to visualize it, so that's one aspect of it. You have another aspect of being able to image it. Here we go. Thank you. Image it. And then lastly, the comparison portion of it. There we go. I do have a slide here. So again, going back, this goes all the way back to the proficiency testing. If you take a look at the National Academy of Sciences recommendation back in 2009 when this was published, they talked about proficiency testing and the importance of proficiency testing. So again, as most labs do, as our lab did as well, we have annual proficiency testing in those particular areas where, again, you're going to offer testimony. If you take a look at SWIGFAST, and as a member of SWIGFAST for a couple of years, certainly they recognize the importance of proficiency testing, and if you take a look at the scope, it's intended to evaluate the individual and also the agency's procedures, as I mentioned before, and one of the newer things that we were doing was testing their ability to be able to work their way through the ABIS system or the APHIS system, depending on what how you refer to it. I will say this, as far as creating a test, the when we talk about the close non-matches, those are very difficult to replicate. The only way you're going to get a close non-match is to be able to take some type of latent impression. And when I say take some type of latent impression, first of all, you have some type of privacy issues. And then to come up with a close non-match, unless you have an identical twin, and the prints many times are very similar, but you would have to put it into an ABIS system to come up with a close non-match. So it's very difficult to create those. Likewise, and again, having created a proficiency test, tonal reversals are very difficult. You happen to see that example of the tonal reversal on the board before, where that was a bloody impression, and it's not uncommon where if I was to see a tonal reversal, they would be in a bloody print. So essentially, some of the ridges have blood on them, they're going to deposit. Likewise, I've wiped some of the blood off, so when I press down, it's going to be the blood in the furrows that shows up, so eventually it goes from ridges being red to furrows being red. So to create those, it's very difficult. And where I'm going with this is, as a test creator, internal proficiency test, it becomes very difficult to replicate those conditions. And again, as I mentioned before, even ANSI, if you take a look at the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, they actually started looking at this back in 2004, and they've tried to replicate some tests as well with very similar results to what we have. The test administration, I talked a little bit about this before. It talks about annually, these are the SWIG-FAST recommendations. All conclusions must be those of the examiner without consultation. That's how do you administer the test, going back to, do you give them the examination once they're done with all the comparisons? Do you have them turn it in? Do you have a verification, as we talk about here in 5.4, but then that must be documented? Again, there are various ways to do this. I started to mention this before, 5.6. Is it open? Is it in the open testing where the examiners are aware they're being tested? Even at that, is it submitted in a case format, or is it administered just as a test and here, take this and work through it? Is it blind in that the examiner doesn't know it, or is it double blind that the agency doesn't know of the testing? So again, there are different formats that you can construct or you could use to test your system as well as your examiner. Even the National Commission. Certainly the National Commission, again, we've certainly recognized this, or it has been recognized and pointed out. Again, they address the need for proficiency testing. And you can see down in the last couple of bullets there, they may be purchased, they may be created externally. Proficiency tests may be created and reported internally. As I mentioned before, the creation of an internal test, again, they vary between crime scene and all of the other disciplines. But if you think about it in the real world, when I'm trying to create a latent print test, basically what we did is we had some volunteers who were depositing prints. Essentially, we processed the prints because we weren't testing the individuals for their processing techniques to develop the prints. What we were looking for is the comparison part of it. So what I'm getting at is to try to create those tonal reversals, very difficult, but we're able to create prints that are, we actually rated them as an ABC as far as the quality. And what we did is, and again, what format, and I know we had some comments, are they latent lifts? Depending on what your lab receives, in this particular case, we had latent lifts in the format that they would receive them in. And when I talk about the format, in this particular case, black powder or metallic powder, likewise digital images, because again, to work a latent lift is different than a digital image from a practitioner point of view. So what type of format are you using? So in this particular case, not only did I have digital images, and those were digital images that were submitted to APHIS, where I knew ground truth as to whether or not I would get a candidate. Likewise, on the latent prints, as I have someone deposit prints as we did, we had plastic surfaces. And again, substrate makes a big difference for clarity. And when you take a look at these prints, and I know there was been some mention about the quality, we actually talk more about clarity now. They're synonymous, but we're getting to clarity because it seems like people understand that a little better. So not only do we have the quantity of, say, level 2 information, those rich details of points, as many of you may refer to them, but we also have the clarity of the image. And again, as I have someone randomly place their hand down, I have no idea how the prints are going to turn out until we actually process those surfaces. So what we try to do is the best we can. And I know there was some mention about having prints of no value. Well, the problem there is when you think about it, as soon as I have this blot, and let's say it's no value, essentially the examination is concluded at that point for the print. I would much rather have a print that's of value, because now they can search the 5 or 6 different individuals and to test their ability or their aptitude to actually compare it and find that match if in fact it's there, or do the exclusion. So to have non-matches, I know there's been some literature, and even ANSI talks about having some prints of null value in there. I would think you'd want to have some prints where you actually have an individual or a person that you could associate it with. PCAST, and again, just going through some of the historical aspect here, they've certainly talked about proficiency testing, and even the AAAS study talked about the proficiency testing and the need for proficiency testing as well. And ISO, and we've heard enough about ISO standards. But again, as I mentioned before, the external, internal, what are we testing the examiner? You've heard me mention that before. How are we administering the test? The test duration, again, is it going to be over a couple days? Is it going to be, again, a sit-down session? But what I did want to talk about as well is also the comments. One of the things that you're going to find is an examiner, and specifically those comments we're pointing out as to whether or not the test is easy. I can tell you right now, as an examiner, having trained examiners assigned to the section, there are certain aptitudes that people have, okay? And I can tell you that I can have a portion of a latent, and there was an article written up 2017 where there are actually no level 2 characteristics or points. It was ID'd on level 3 detail. It was out in Illinois, I believe, or Indiana. But what I'm getting at is there are certain individuals who, like any latent examiner, they have some pride in the work they do. I can give them a portion of a latent or a fragment of a latent, and they can automatically orient that and say, you know what, I'm looking at the right side of a finger, I'm looking at the left side of a palm. And many times when they do take these tests, again, having been the director of that particular lab at the time, as I get the exams back, when they would take the exams, certainly some individuals find it very easy, and they pride themselves, and I found it was pretty quick. And there are others that may not necessarily struggle, but they take their time, and again, depending on at least their assessment of the quality of the latent, they may work that through. So some of those statements in there don't necessarily reflect that, and as I just mentioned that ANSI study that I have, they started in 2004, and they did these 6 different testings of collaborative exercises, and different countries actually put it together. In 2004, they actually had the first exam. It was put together by Estonia, and essentially they had several false positives in there, and again, erroneous identifications. But one of the things that they did find, and that's another thing you need to consider when you're putting together a proficiency test, is how much information does that person get? There are those out there that say they shouldn't have any information, they just get this, and that's all they have. But in this particular case, when you have a non-porous surface, this print happened to be on a piece of plastic, and it happened to touch or come in contact with another surface, and it is possible that a print can transfer. It does happen, and it's called laterally reverse prints. So essentially what's right is left and left is right. In this particular case, one of the latents had that phenomenon occur, because it doesn't happen that often. And as they passed out the test, it wasn't until after the test had been taken where they had these erroneous conclusions. And again, in the event, or in this case, if they would have told the examiner that this happened to be on plastic, the examiner may have considered the fact that you have this possibility of laterally reverse prints. So again, it's not as easy as one may think that you put these exams together and hand them out, because again, to be able to replicate some of the conditions that we see in casework, and I would say that tonal reversals, and again, I've been around for a little while, you don't see those very often. Close non-matches, absolutely. In fact, I advocate, we had this case come up in Massachusetts a few years ago. Okay, well, with a close, you said 20 after. Okay. With a close non, I would tell you with a close, I keep watching the clock. With a close non-matches, I would just say this: the computer creates an algorithm. It's not as good as a human, and what we've found is in those close non-matches, when you actually pull them up, I've done that on occasion because we had a court motion, and when we started to pull them up, it was very clear once you started to look at the latent to the ink, and my suggestion to the prosecutor was, you know what, let's give them all the close non-matches and we can show the jury how far off the computer is as to how close the computer was. In this particular case, it depends upon your algorithm, and I'm to my last 30 seconds, so thank you very much.